energy efficiency, energy markets, energy sector regulation. Energy efficiency obligations are one of our main areas of focus, and we have experience in Europe as well as global experience with design and implementation of EEOs. I realize, looking at the people who are introducing themselves, that we have an audience largely from Europe, but not only, so I'll try my best to, we're mainly focusing on Europe, but I'll try to be clear where there are some regional specificities. So today's presentation focuses on energy efficiency obligations. We'll be referring periodically to the EEO Toolkit, which is a guide written by Ian Lease and myself that walks through the many considerations that go into the design and implementation of an EEO. We'll be referring to energy efficiency obligations, or EEOs, obligations interchangeably. These can also be referred to as white certificate schemes, which may include, but not necessarily, a trading element. They're also sometimes referred to as energy supplier obligations, or in the U.S. in particular as energy efficiency resource or performance standards. We're going to stick to EEOs today. So today we'll start with an introduction into EEOs, what we mean by an EEO, talk a bit about implementation in Europe, and some of the key design features. We'll then cover 4 of the key considerations that we cover more of them in our toolkit. We'll focus on deciding on policy objectives, determining eligible end-use sectors, protection of low-income households, and bill impact and cost recovery. This is a snapshot of the various policy instruments that are being applied by member states in Europe to comply with their energy savings targets under Article 7 of the EED. The EED stands for Energy Efficiency Directive. Article 7 allows member states to meet their targets through energy efficiency obligations, through alternative policies and measures, or through a combination of the two. As you can see here, energy efficiency obligations are expected to account for the largest share of savings in Europe. It's also worth noting that EEOs are also a dominant policy instrument, driving programmatic energy savings in the U.S. and in other parts of the world as well. So what is an EEO? At its core, it's an obligation on some part of an energy company or legal entity to save end-use energy through energy efficiency measures. EEOs are often backed by penalties or financial incentives. So to give an example, there might be an obligation on electricity and gas suppliers in a country to save energy, or as is the case in some U.S. states in particular, the energy companies simply collect the money and the obligation for delivering the savings with that money is placed on a third party. Aside from these basic elements, EEOs can be shaped in quite different ways. So under Article 7 of the European Energy Efficiency Directive, the obligation falls to energy distributors or retail energy sales companies. Energy may include any combination of electricity, gas, heat, or transport fuel. Article 7 sets a cumulative end-use energy savings target equivalent to 1.5% of annual energy sales per year, and it goes till 2020. Member states may also meet this target with alternative policies and measures, as I noted. It's also important to mention that a number of exemptions in the directive have the practical effect of reducing the target by about 1/2. The discussion of energy efficiency obligations is important both because of the scope of the instrument in Europe, as we just saw on the previous slide, and also given the likelihood that Article 7 will be extended beyond 2020. This webinar doesn't focus on the proposed revisions to the EED, but it's important to note that these revisions are under development and to be released by the Commission in October. And based on responses to the Commission's consultation earlier in the year, there's strong support to continue with EEOs. Today, EEOs are in place or planned in at least 17 member states, and 2 more seem to be seriously considering introducing an EEO. As you can see, this is not a new mechanism for many countries, though it's worth noting that some EEOs have been modified to comply with Article 7, So this is what's meant by existing or modified in the first bullet. For example, some schemes have evolved from a non-binding target to a binding target, or the scope of the obligation has expanded. Many EEOs are in the early design stages. The EED is only a few years old. And while EEOs are a flexible policy instrument in that they can be tailored to fit within the structure of energy companies and national policy priorities, so they're sort of tailored to be country specific, there are many lessons that can be learned from existing programs. So it's important to note that while we're focusing today on EEOs or energy efficiency obligations, they're in fact part of a broader framework of policies that together drive the energy efficiency market. So for context, this slide demonstrates sort of the general structure. On the one hand, you have building codes, labeling guidelines, and appliance standards that set minimum requirements to push the market towards more efficient goods and services. And on the other, you have EEOs, other energy efficiency programs, and various incentive schemes that help pull the market to accelerate uptake of new technologies and approaches. So this push-pull dynamic is essential, and EEOs can play a very prominent role by providing a long-term, reliable mechanism to drive progress on energy efficiency. They also work well in this broader framework alongside other energy efficiency policies. So with all of the available policies and instruments that are out there, why place the obligation on energy companies? Energy companies can be an important player in funding and delivering of energy savings for a number of reasons, some of which are listed here. Many of these companies are directly connected to consumers as distribution or retail providers. This allows them to interact directly with customers or to support those who do. Paying for energy efficiency through energy bills provides a stable source of revenues, often more stable than public funding, which can vary from year to year. And if you think about it, through an EEO, customers pay for energy savings as an energy resource on their bill, just as they pay for power from renewables, nuclear, coal, gas. This is one application of the so-called efficiency first principle, which prioritizes investment in efficiency as a resource to the energy system. Lastly, as you can see with the new deal for energy consumers issued last year by the European Commission and the work on a winter package relating to the internal energy market for electricity, energy companies have an increasingly important role to play in other areas. This includes consumer education, smart metering, tariff reform, lowering peak demand, and distribution planning, to name a few. So energy efficiency is another important area to meet broader goals relating to customer empowerment and realization of a competitive, efficient, and clean energy market in Europe. On more than one occasion, I've been told that it's a bit crazy to obligate energy companies to reduce their sales. There's an inherent conflict with the traditional utility business model, which is based on increasing profits by selling more and not by saving energy. There are several ways to approach this conflict. First, for regulated energy companies, in Europe those would be the transmission and distribution companies, it's important to decouple revenues from sales. This is often done by introducing a revenue cap that ensures a fixed level of revenues, regardless of sales levels, for a fixed period of time. Shared savings or bonuses can help incentivize companies to achieve or exceed targets. These can be considered in a framework of incentive regulation, for example, that aims to incentivize certain types of energy company investment to align with priorities. For competitive suppliers, the picture is a bit different. There's no explicit mechanism for cost recovery in general. An obligation on all suppliers simply becomes a cost of doing business. In Europe, at least, electricity supply is a competitive market. And lastly and importantly, end-use energy efficiency can be part of a progressive business model. As you see in the internal energy market and the New Deal for energy consumers, the world is changing. Customers are increasingly a resource rather than just a passive taker on the system. And energy companies are having to adjust to these new developments. It's worth just making a note here that the district heating sector in particular faces many challenges in Europe today. particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, where older district heating systems are in need of upgrading, while at the same time losing customers who disconnect from the grid, losing sales due to increased energy efficiency, where the heating companies are expected to be obligated. This is an issue that comes up. And it's important to note that EEOs aren't the cause of the problem, and in fact may represent a way forward by decreasing consumption, which can help save on customer bills. To end the overview of energy efficiency obligations, this is a snapshot of the various sections of the toolkit. The toolkit is organized into 4 main themes: setting the objective, selecting appropriate design features, compliance regime, and the review process. If you go to the toolkit, you can click around to access various topics directly. It would take quite a while to go through the whole thing, so today we're focusing on just a few of the elements covered: policy objectives, eligible sectors, low-income households, and bill impact and cost recovery. So first, deciding on policy objectives. At the outset of establishing an EEO, it's very important to have clear policy objectives. There is, of course, the obvious objective of saving energy, but in addition to that, there may be other objectives, such as reducing bills, improving air quality, reducing CO2 emissions. There may be other environmental goals that can be supported, job creation, economic growth, tackling energy poverty for vulnerable consumers. These are just a few of the types of objectives that the policymakers may want to include as part of the goal of an EEO. In fact, if you were to list the benefits of energy efficiency achieved through energy efficiency obligations, there's quite a broad range of benefits that you can find. And these can often be quantified in various terms, in terms of financial savings, energy savings, emissions reductions, and feed into various national or local policy objectives. This here is a simplified depiction of the many benefits that energy efficiency can deliver. It's based on the IEA report on multiple benefits of energy efficiency from 2014 in RAP's own analysis. As you can see, the benefits can broadly be divided into 3 groups: participant benefits, utility system benefits, and broader societal benefits. Ian will discuss these in a bit more detail, but I note them here to emphasize the value of energy efficiency obligations in delivering on multiple policy objectives, in addition to saving energy or complying with the Energy Efficiency Directive. Setting clear objectives is important for several reasons. Firstly, it can help steer the design of the obligation. For example, it can help determine which sectors are eligible and to what degree. For example, will it be the residential, commercial, industrial, other sectors that are eligible, and are there some minimum requirements for savings in certain sectors? Just to cite one example. The objectives, combined with other considerations like the energy savings potential in each sector, ease of delivery of energy savings, and political considerations to steer the design. Other important considerations that tie into the objectives are whether any particular measures or sectors should be included or excluded. And really importantly, by setting objectives, there are concrete goals against which to evaluate progress. And this last piece is, of course, important from the perspective of sustaining public support and transparency on what EEOs are delivering. So to get a bit more specific, this slide is from the toolkit, and it represents explicit policy objectives for 11 member state energy efficiency obligations. And as you can see, delivery of cost-effective energy savings and bill reduction is the most common objective, unsurprisingly. But there are other important objectives like CO2 reductions, improved energy security, assisting low-income households, and stimulating the energy services market that clearly factor into the energy efficiency obligations. It's worth noting that other energy efficiency policies and programs will also deliver on these objectives to some extent, whether they're explicitly stated or not. But again, clearly defining expectations and goals can help with design with meeting these goals and also maintain support for energy efficiency obligations. So the next section is eligible end-use sectors. So the question is which sectors should be prioritized within an energy efficiency obligation. Here we have the same 11 member states shown a minute ago, but this time focusing on the eligible end-use sectors. And as you can see, in most of these member states, energy savings in all sectors are eligible, or at least most sectors, to count towards the obligation. So those would be residential, commercial, public, industry, transport, and agriculture. Transport and agriculture are a bit less common if you look at which sectors are prioritized. And the UK, it's worth noting, is a bit unique in that it focuses just on residential savings. A few words on things that this table does not show. First, although transport is an eligible end-use sector in several member states, in practice only Ireland and France obligate transport companies to deliver savings. And savings in the transport sector are actually expected to account for a very small share of overall savings from EEOs and under Article 7. Until now, most savings from EEOs in Europe have come from buildings. And a couple of member states, in particular Denmark and Italy, have placed a greater focus on the industrial sector. And here the focus tends to be on measurable and replicable measures, such as efficient motors, drives, pumps, compressors, these types of industrial process savings. So a little bit more on transport savings. Transport, in addition to buildings, is an important sector under the effort sharing decision, which covers the sectors that are not covered under the EU ETS, the emissions trading scheme. And as noted, only 2 member states at the moment have included transport as an obligated sector. And even in these member states, many of the savings achieved by obligated transport fuel suppliers have in fact been achieved through measures in other sectors like household. So I'll pause here just to explain an important point, which is that most schemes allow obligated companies to deliver their savings target in any sector. So for example, electricity companies can deliver heat savings, transport companies can deliver electricity savings in buildings, and these will count towards their target. Only 3% of all savings notified by member states under Article 7 are expected to come from transport. And this is in large part because transport savings tend to be less attractive than savings in other sectors.
Thank you, Edith. Ian Lee's here, and I'll take over the presentation now. And I want to talk about protection of low-income households. And I want to start by saying, well, why would we even think about doing this? And there are several reasons. The first is, if you like, a form of social equity. All customers pay for the energy efficiency obligation. And if you didn't ring fence or protect low-income households, it would be very logical for energy companies to invest in end-use customers who could pay towards the cost of the energy efficiency measures. The second point is that energy efficiency is a solution to lowering bills and improving living conditions and family health, particularly for those homes who experience what's known as fuel or energy poverty. So these are examples of countries with energy efficiency obligations which specifically address fuel or energy poverty. And the requirement is in Ireland is that 5% of all savings have to be achieved in households classified as being in fuel poverty. In the United Kingdom, since its inception in 1994, a large share of the energy savings has had to be achieved in low-income households from the start of the energy efficiency obligations back in 1994. At the moment, it's increasingly the energy efficiency obligation in the UK is increasingly focusing on energy poverty, but it's not clear what's going to happen after 2018. And that's because the Green Deal, which was widely triumphed as the way that we were going to solve energy efficiency investment in those households not on low incomes, turned out to be a political aspiration rather than a substantial way to deliver energy efficiency, and has now been abandoned. So we're not clear what's going to happen next, but I'm sure that the protection of low-income households will continue in the future. In France, similar arrangements happened in the last few years, where obligated parties can support fuel poverty programs as an alternative to delivering energy savings through the usual channels. And finally, a different way of trying to encourage investment in low-income households is being undertaken in Austria, where the companies receive an uplift factor of the actual energy savings by multiplying it by 1.5. I'd now like to tackle the point which is always raised. This costs money. So how are we going to pay for all of this? Well, of course, you've probably guessed. The answer is it's the end-use customer, us, that always in the end pays in one way or another. But there are a couple of aspects I would like to address here. First is the impact on the energy bill for end users. And secondly is the cost recovery. And just to try and balance things, I want to keep reminding everyone and go into a little more detail on how, while a focus on cost is correct and important, it's also equally important to look at the benefit side, and in particular the multiple benefits. So let's start by reminding ourselves just how effective these energy efficiency obligations are globally. The US experience, and more than half of the US states now actually have an energy efficiency obligation of some sort, and they save electricity, which is about half what the generation cost alone is. Now, the experience in the EU is similar, and if you look at residential electricity or gas and the energy savings, they're costing less than 25% of the cost of that fuel to the consumer. Now, given that roughly for gas and for electricity, about half the cost that the household consumer will pay is cost of electricity at the wholesale markets and the cost of gas at the wholesale markets, then you can see the figures are remarkably similar to the US experience. So they're really very good value in terms of saving energy rather than buying it. Now, the other benefit is, as Edith mentioned earlier, energy efficiency can save on transmission and distribution upgrades, or by deferring them in some cases, or even actually avoiding the need for them altogether, as in New York a few years ago. It also requires lower reserve margins of electric plant, so you can save money on capacity markets. It reduces line losses, because by the laws of physics, the energy in the wires loses, through Ohm's law, it loses energy by the square of the current it has to carry. And although people tend to say it's 5 or 6%, at peak times that energy loss can be can be nearly up to 15%. So at peak times, and that is incredibly valuable electricity, because you pay a lot of money for electricity at peak times. So this can have an important impact. It also has no emissions. Energy efficiency has no emissions. It can improve the reliability, and it lowers the peak loads. There is also a merit order effect in competitive power markets, the lower demand for energy will lower the clearing price for all consumers. That means not just those consumers who save energy by taking part in the energy efficiency programs, but the benefit is for all consumers. And as I'll show later, in some USA cases, these non-end use benefits can justify the entire cost of the energy efficiency program. So how are the costs passed through? Ian's partly covered this, but just for completeness, we thought we would cover it here again. If the obligation is on an energy retailer in a liberalised market, then the costs of the EEOs are simply a cost of business. Like all the other environmental requirements they have to satisfy, renewables, the cost of renewables, etc., and they're passed on to the end customers. Now, why would there be any incentive to deliver this as cheaply as possible? Because the energy retailers are in a competitive environment, and therefore it's an incentive for them to deliver this at the lowest cost possible. Now, of course, in many parts of the world, not just the distribution is regulated, but if the retail price is still regulated, then you have a different approach. Edith has mentioned the importance of actually decoupling the costs of, the revenue from the amount of energy distributed. And if the price is regulated, then the cost will be in the regulated tariff charged to the end customers. And so there should be no loss of income to the energy company. In effect, it's the end user, us, that is paying for it, and a kind of polluter pays principle applies. However, it's important, as I will go on to describe in a second, that multiple energy savings benefits that can be achieved through energy efficiency obligations exceed the cost to customers. And globally, it's typically 1 to 5% of energy bills. More typical, I would say, is the range 2 to 3 is probably a good average of what it's been costing. Now, I want to focus not just on costs, but to look at other things to see the benefits. And I apologize, I made a mistake here. In this slide and in the next slide, when I talk about 9 times more effective, the figure should be 7. So apologies for that mistake. I wanted to try and illustrate how this is much more effective than a price rise using household data. And the reason for this is really very simple. You need to increase prices by 10% for electricity in order to have a 2% reduction in energy consumption. So what I did was I used the data, the real data for the period 2005 to 8 on the levelized cost to electricity suppliers in the British energy efficiency obligation, and that was 2 euro cents per kilowatt hour. I used the actual electricity savings attained by the energy suppliers in that period, and they're primarily insulation, 36%, lighting, 34%, and appliances, information, technology, communications, gaming, etc., 29%. Now, of course, some of the electricity savings are from shorter-lived measures, so I have taken account of that the savings do not last all through the period between 2005 to 2020. And what this shows in the next slide is just that the EEOs are 9 times more effective than a one-off price rise. So let me try and explain. If you look at the blue line, which is the lower line, then this is what happens if you had a 3% rise in prices due to, say, a carbon tax or an energy tax. Then, of course, with the price elasticity, that would reduce energy demand by 0.6%. And that would do it each year And if you don't increase the tax or the price rise, then it goes along, and that's the cumulative energy savings from a one-off 3% price rise. But suppose we say, okay, we've taken 3%, and by the way, 3% was what the cost to the energy consumers was for the energy efficiency obligation, and we simply invest in each of these years, you invest that one-off price rise, then it's not rocket science, because you have the benefit of the minus 0.6%, but you're investing every year an additional 3% money in energy efficiency measures. And so by 2020, you save 7 times more, again I stress, apologies for my typing mistake, 7 times more energy from electricity than from a one-off price rise. So they are much more beneficial than just simply trying to use crude energy taxation on households. Now let me talk about the multiple benefits, and Edith's already flagged up the great work that the IEA have done on this area, and as the references are in our toolkit. But this is a diagrammatic representation of the multiple benefits for this northeast state of the US, Vermont, and they have done a lot of really good underpinning work in this area. And you can see here that the multiple benefits in terms of the benefits are dominated by the energy generation, as you would expect, a little bit of CO2, line losses, I talked about that, and distribution capacity. Now, if I look at these in more tabular form, I've also included which of these benefits affects all customers or just those that participated in it. So this is the study of what the Vermont bills in the US, and it's expressed in US dollars. So if we look at the levelized cost on the Vermont bills of the energy efficiency obligation, it was $39 US per megawatt hour, which is roughly 3 euro cents per kilowatt hour. Now obviously the big one, the avoided energy costs, and that just benefits the consumers who took part in the actual program. Now the big numbers are the distribution capacity costs. By reducing energy, particularly at peak times, you do not need to reinforce the distribution network. Other important ones, line losses, and this was actually done when the European EU ETS was at $15 a tonne. Remember those happy days? And of course, it's much lower. It would be much lower than that with modern prices. But there's an important one which was not done in Vermont, because in Vermont, the renewable resource obligation is a fixed amount of electricity generated, whereas in Europe, it's a percentage of the energy and electricity generation. And if you reduce the energy, then you reduce the cost of the most expensive renewables, and that would be a benefit would happen here. But the bottom line is that the multiple benefits are greater to the non-participating customers. In other words, to all customers, they are greater than the levelized cost on the Vermont bills alone. Now, I'm delighted to say that there is actually a European project now underway looking at trying to do this multiple benefits analysis for Europe, and I look forward to the results of that. So finally, picture of the toolkit presentation, and that was done with particular focus in mind, which was not just EEOs, but also looking at how they address the requirements of the EU Energy Efficiency Directive. There are In the acknowledgements page, you'll see other references, and one I would mention in particular is a RAP study about determining energy savings for energy efficiency obligations, which is relevant to all energy saving determination, again required under the Energy Efficiency Directive. And with that, I hand you back to Roman.